A podcast is more than just an audio channel. And a branded podcast can unlock a ton of opportunities for your company, but not all small marketing teams understand how to connect the dots and really have a podcast fit into their entire overall marketing strategy. In today's episode, I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to bring in some very interesting quotes from previous podcast episodes of recorded content. And I'll pull in some examples from other podcasters to help paint a picture for you about what a podcast can actually do for your company and its overall marketing strategy. Podcasts have been around for quite some time. In fact, I actually produced my very first podcast about 12 years ago. The podcast really stemmed from a live event production where folks would give keynote speeches and then we would repurpose them into an audio format and publish as a podcast episode. And just about everyone associates a podcast with an audio file. It's something that you can access when using your phone, when you're on a walk with your dog, or when you're going on a long road trip. But according to Zach Moreno, the CEO and co founder of Squadcast, podcasts are so much more now. Most people still view podcast as an audio format, an MP3 that lives in an RSS feed. But what is a podcast today from your perspective?
Yeah, and to go back to our kind of cultural roots and principle in listening, we were a bit confused how video fit into that picture as well. When podcasters first started telling us that they wanted that in addition to the audio, it wasn't obvious to us. So what we did was really try to understand that before we, started working on anything in that vein. And that really led us to this kind of trifecta of informed that experience. And it's really three pieces. So Edison Research is responsible for releasing the Infinite Dial report, which has a lot of interesting data through polls that they do with both creators and consumers of audio content. And they interviewed a bunch of listeners to podcasts and found that audience members really think of it not as a podcast, but they think of it with like as a show, a capital S show. And a
Hmm.
audio podcast is a big part of that show, but the video of that conversation is another way that an audience member may choose to engage with that show, as are show notes and transcripts and websites and episode teaser videos that have become very popular thanks to our friends at Headliner. So that was really eye-opening to us because that's how we think about quality. That is our focus at Squadcast is audio quality, quality content, followed by reliability. But we believe that quality matters because of your audience experience. So when we learned that audiences also wanted video to enhance that, that was a big piece of that story. Another was the promo opportunities to help podcasters create content that help gain traction with new audiences or grow their show, as well as just growth opportunities to distribute content on multiple platforms. So podcasters are very familiar with submitting their show to Spotify and Apple and all of these different places that make it easy for listeners to find their show. And we started to think of YouTube as an extension of that, or video as an
Right.
extension of that.
Like Zach says, it's more about having a show and it's about creating long form content as a podcast initially and then repurposing everything downstream so that your customers get access to the information in a lot of different ways. But what does this look like in real life? How can you start to think about weaving your company's podcast into its overall marketing strategy? And then how can you start to think about your podcast as a way to drive really all the content that you produce? In a conversation I had with Mike Wolber, the Chief Revenue Officer of Rent Dynamics, we uncovered how his company uses a podcast to really drive all of their content. And in the conversation I had with Mike on recorded content, we talked about how it's possible to use a single podcast episode and actually drive content for an entire month.
And the podcast is one of the most easy ways to get a boatload of content that can be changed in a bunch of different arenas. Some that are easy to measure and monitor, and some that are a little bit more difficult. And it's also a really great way to get an engine of content that you can use as your single source of creation that you can then replicate into blogs or videos or tweet storms, or things that you can ask your company to share from like more of a guerrilla marketing standpoint. And it's also a really great way to connect with people in a way that doesn't really feel salesy. I think that I'm really realizing that most people are up for joining a podcast, even if they don't work with you. And if I'm a brand, what an awesome way, if I'm especially in the early days trying to kind of find product market fit or
Mhm.
find kind of my nuance and area of focus. What a great way to go talk with potential customers in a way that's going to help them amplify their career or their brand, definitely going to amplify yours. And along the way, there will be dividends, even if they're kind of difficult to measure. So really trying to encourage people to think about it, but also to act on it like I'm doing this year, and use it as a way to really play a bigger content role. And you see it with how you promote your stuff. You can take a single episode and it can be an entire month's worth of content if you do it right. And I think that's what we're just starting to realize.
Like Mike said, you can get a boatload of content from your podcast episode. But it's not just about the different content formats you can create. Yes, it's great to record a video podcast and then repurpose that into audio and written formats. However, when you think about a podcast as a show, you start to move away from the mindset that a podcast is just this audio channel. And if you set your podcast up the right way from the beginning, you get away from one-off content projects and you shift more towards a connected content strategy, all designed to help your audience, which is your ideal customer profile. So how do you make that switch? How do you use your podcast as a way to drive a lot of your overall marketing strategy? Well, in an episode with Jacob Miller, I had a chance to uncover what works at Headway. Headway is a company that helps startups launch their business and acquire their very first customers. At Headway, they actually use a collection of 3 different shows to drive their overall marketing strategy.
We're also in this position of the company where we now actually have like a full marketing team, where it was mostly just me before for about a year or two. And then slowly folks started getting added to the marketing team for us to help it kind of grow. And then now it's like we actually are cross-functional. We're actually collaborating with our product strategists that do client work, but they're starting to help us like reconfigure our messaging. They're helping us with customer research. We're interviewing founders, all that kind of stuff. So we're now more collaborative, where before it was like, hey, marketing's going to get this done. We were kind of in silos, but now we're like actually like meeting every week and like talking about the things that we're working on together, instead of like dividing and conquering, regrouping and being like, wait, what is this? Like all of a sudden, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So we're it's something that we're working on and we're getting better at it, and it's starting to get really fun because we're actually like getting through like the feedback loops faster, because we're actually like being intentional about meeting and getting the information we need to make those changes on the feedback and stuff.
So as you can see, a podcast is way more than an audio channel. It can actually drive your entire content marketing strategy. So when you create a podcast, try to focus on 2 key things. First, define a very specific target audience. And second, identify how your show can help, which is often helping your audience overcome a very specific problem. If you do these 2 things, it's much easier to integrate a podcast into your overall marketing strategy. So that's all I have for today. Thanks for joining me on this episode of Recorded Content, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Recorded Content, a show brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcasting agency for B2B tech marketers. We do the podcast stuff so you can focus on strategy, building brand awareness, and developing new relationships. To learn more about how you can launch and grow a podcast for your company, check out motionagency.io. Thanks for listening to Recorded Content.